Welcome to the second session of the GLO EHERO special sessions. And we have four presenters in this session. First will be Arthur Grimes, then Philip Morrison, then me and Randall, and finally Stephanie. And for the first three papers, there will be a discussant. So it will be 15 minutes of presentation, followed by 5 minutes by a discussant, and then 5 minutes of general discussion. And for the final presentation of Stephanie, this is a book chapter of the Handbook of Labor and Population Economics. And this will not have a discussant.
Boo.
Boo, yeah. Well, but we will have general discussion, and you have extra time for general discussion, Stephanie. So everyone has 25 minutes in total. Then let's see. Arthur, you can start, and I'll give you the option to share your screen. So you should be able to share your screen now. You're still muted, Arthur, as well.
Okay, can you hear that?
Yes.
And can you see the screen?
No.
Okay, for some reason you haven't maybe. Share screen. Oh, here we go. Okay, can you see that now?
Yes, now you can see it. Great. Okay, and when there's 1 minute left, I will tell you.
Okay, see if I can get rid of this thing. Where do I do that? Hide. Great. Hopefully this disappears. Yeah. Okay, so this is a paper written with two colleagues. It's down as Diana Tam and Arthur Grimes, but it's also with a colleague, Nicholas Watson. Diana was a student of mine. And she's both a law and economics student. And what we've been working on with Nick's help is to look at a subjective well-being approach to thinking about the benefits of free speech. So there's a famous quote, which is often wrongly attributed to Voltaire. It's actually by a novelist, Hall, writing about Voltaire, saying, "I disapprove of what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it." And so what we're going to be looking at is not so much look at free speech as a whole, but who benefits from free speech. It'll be a cross-country study, and we're looking at which types of people benefit most from free speech. And we have two alternative hypotheses. One is that it may be that individuals with greater resources benefit the most, say those who have got high income or high education, thinking about free speech as being essentially a luxury good. The second is that it might be the individuals with fewer resources, lower income or lower education, and for them free speech is necessary because they don't have access to the people who are high up in the echelons of decision-making in society. So we're going to be testing whether there's an income or education gradient for free speech in terms of who benefits the most. And just to, as a spoiler, in case we don't get to the end, key finding is that free speech benefits those with fewer resources the most. In other words, it has an empowerment effect for those who have got fewer resources. So just a bit of background. We can think of this subject going back at least to John Stuart Mill, his famous treatise on liberty, talked about what's called a marketplace of ideas. Being an economist, of course, he thought about it as being a marketplace. He said that ideas have positive externalities and that others can build on them, can use them, which is a very similar concept to endogenous growth theory, modern endogenous growth theory. He argued that the marketplace would make sure that the fittest ideas survive and the others will die away. And in the judicial literature, this was supported strongly by Oliver Wendell Holmes, the famous US judge back in 1919. Since then, however, there's been some revisions, and another US judge, Justice Hand, argued that actually free speech could be curtailed, and essentially he came up with this formulation that said if the cost imposed by suppressing information is less than the probability that the speech can cause harm times the amount of social cost caused by that harm, then some limitations on free speech may be justified. So essentially a cost-benefit analysis that he applied. He was obviously a legal person, but after that Coase came along and also later Posner, and they said, well, if we're thinking about the marketplace for ideas, then we should think about, we should be regulating the marketplace for ideas just the same way we regulate the markets for goods. And in some cases, we decide it's beneficial to regulate the markets for goods. So, as Posner said, we should subject free speech to the acid bath of economics to ascertain whether regulation is warranted. So the more recent literature, both in economics and law, has suggested that maybe some limitations on free speech are justified. Now, just then bringing a well-being lens onto this, if we think about the first hypothesis that we had, which is that free speech might be a luxury good, that essentially fits in with Maslow's hierarchy. Self-fulfillment needs, which could include free expression, are at the top of the hierarchy, which suggests that free speech would most benefit those with the most resources. And some papers have, in the literature, have noted Maslow's hierarchy in this respect. On the other hand, we also know that free speech and human rights more generally, most of the literature is actually on human rights more generally, there's a positive association between human rights and subjective well-being. I note some of the classic papers there, but those papers don't normally say which people benefit most from human rights or free speech. The other thing to note is that these studies that I've listed here are all associative. None of them have tried any causal analysis on the effects of human rights or free speech on subjective well-being. One other aspect that I want to just draw attention to is the work of Oliver Williamson in his Nobel Prize giving sort of summary, I guess, in Journal of Economic Literature, talks about the really strong importance of cultural values, which are very long-lasting, maybe hundreds of years in the making, on way that people might approach things like human rights, etc. And so the lesson from Williamson's work is that when we're doing empirical work on this across countries, we need to be able to control for different cultural norms. And in our case, we'll do that through using country fixed effects with repeated cross-section data. The data that we'll use a World Value Survey from wave 1 to wave 7. That will be used for the subjective well-being and personal characteristics of individuals. We use the CRIGHTS database for free speech and also for other human rights. This is a database that goes right back to 1970 or so and rates pretty much almost all countries in the world on the basis of about 14 different human rights, including free speech, annually. Then we'll use the World Bank for some macroeconomic data to control for time-varying country conditions. Our sample in the end is almost 250,000 people from 67 countries, covering 168 country waves across the World Value Survey, going through from wave 1 to wave 7. And the countries included comprise 83% of the world's population. The dependent variable, everyone in this group will know the standard life satisfaction question from the World Values Survey. All things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? From 1 to 10, completely dissatisfied, up till completely satisfied. Our freedom of speech variable is measured in some ways quite crudely, but probably from a quite reasonably. It's just a 3-degree scale, 0 for no free speech, 2 for complete free speech, and 1 for somewhere in between. We introduce control variables for other human rights, which are the other human rights that are included in the CRIGHTS database, and we take the first principal component of the other 13 rights variables and put that as a human rights variable. We have from the World Value Survey personal characteristics on all the things you see there, standard things, age, sex, marital status, number of children, education, income, employment status, religiosity, town size, and politics. The macro variables that we have for time varying conditions across countries are GDP per capita at purchasing power parity and also life expectancy. And then we have country fixed effects and wave fixed effects to proxy, obviously country norms, some cultural norms, and also wave fixed effects for what might be going on across the world. Just to give you an idea of the free speech data, that's in terms of the country waves, we see that almost half, not quite half, somewhat have some degree of free speech. Then about a third have complete free speech, and others have 0 degree of free speech. In case we're worried that countries don't transition in this database, it is a bit of a concern, but we see that if we look at wave W-1 through to wave W, so in other words, successive waves of the World Value Survey, countries that start off with a 0 for free speech, 4 of them move up to a 1 in the next wave, 11 stay the same. If they're on a 1, 6 of them move down to 0, 6 of them move up to 2. If they're on a 2, 20 of them stay the same and 8 of them move down. And overall, of the 67 countries, we have 22 countries that change their speech degree of free speech at least once through the 168 country waves. So the methodology, we're going to be interested in an equation of this sort of form where we have life satisfaction of individual I and country C at time t as a function of the free speech variable being 0, 1 or 2. We also have the human rights variable, and the human rights variable interacted with free speech. And the way I've just written it here is I interact all 3 levels of speech with human rights, although equivalently I could have had human rights as a separate variable interacted with 2 levels of free speech, same thing. And then the variable that we're particularly interested in, which is the gradient on free speech interacted with income. And here income will be measured in quintiles. So we'll have 5 interaction terms, and we'll be looking at that gradient, the beta IF coefficients, to see which was it the high income people or low income people that benefit most from free speech. Then we have, sorry, I should have put all these definitions there. The personal characteristics is P. It's a vector, and that includes their income. So the base income variables are in there. We have the macroeconomic controls M, and then the country and the wave and country fixed effects, lambda W, lambda C. So the coefficients of interest are the beta IF coefficients, the gradient coefficients on free speech. And then we will run the same equation, but instead of interacting income with free speech, we'll interact education levels with free speech. There'll be 3 levels of education, primary, secondary, and tertiary, basically. Now, how do we identify the coefficients, knowing whether it might be a causal relationship or not? As I say, we're only interested in this gradient term, the gradient of speech with respect to income. And there's a recent paper published in Econometric Reviews, I think it is, by Bunn and Harrison, which demonstrates conditions. It's a bit like the Lubell approach, but a little bit but different. If we have a variable X that's endogenous, another variable at W is exogenous, then under certain conditions, the coefficient on the interaction term is unbiased, even when the regression is estimated by OLS. Now, one of the conditions in which this unbiased result comes is if W term, the exogenous term, is a binary variable. And in our case, those terms will be all binary variables. They'll be either income quintiles or education dummy variables. So what this result implies is that we can look at the interaction term, income times speech or education times speech, and even though we can't interpret the overall speech coefficient, we can interpret the gradient coefficients as being unbiased estimates of the true relationship. An alternative approach that we use is to use instrumental variables, where we instrument speech with an instrument, and in this case we'll omit the human rights variable, because we only can devise one instrument in this case, but the instrument will also be constructed so that the emitted variable bias should not be a problem. So in this case, we're going to have to convert speech into two alternative forms for the instrumental variables approach. We'll either treat speech as cardinals, in other words, the gap between 0 and 1 is the same as the gap between 1 and 2, or we'll use it as a binary variable, and in this case we'll actually have 0 versus the group of countries that are 1 or 2 that have some degree of free speech. And we'll have the same sort of equation as we had before: speech, income times speech, the interaction terms, plus the other control variables for personal characteristics, macroeconomic variables, etc. And we'll also estimate the same equation with education times speech to look at the education gradient. Now, where do we get our instrument for speech in this case? This is where we use part of Williamson's ideas as well about cultural groups, and Engelhardt and Wetzel came up with a map for cultural groups. We estimate, we hypothesize that speech in a country C will be related to speech, the levels of free speech in countries in their culture group in the previous year. So if, and we also include wave fixed effects and country fixed effects. So we're essentially looking at speech. So if there's been changes in the level of free speech in countries in your culture group in the previous year, then you may move in the same direction in your country as well. And I'll list the countries, the culture groups later on. So this is the first stage regression for the instrumental variables regression, in both whether we include speech as a cardinal variable or a binary variable. So we have two different specifications, and we'll see that even with country and year fixed effects, we get a highly significant coefficient on speech and the lagged level of speech in the culture group, excluding your own country. And so that's our, and then we devise our instrument based on the predicted value of speech from there. The culture groups are listed down the bottom there, and these are the culture groups that Engelhardt et al. Have listed. So if we look at the OLS estimates, and I'm just putting in the income gradient coefficients here, if we look at this first column, and the one that I'm sort of circling now with my cursor, in the first column we interact both score 1, free speech score 1, which is a mid-level of free speech, with the income quintiles, and we also interact free speech level 2 with the income quintiles. And we see in both cases that the coefficients are highest for the lowest income quintile, then they come down through to the 4th income quintile, and the base level is the 5th, the top income quintile, which is 0. So that's both with free speech score 1 and also with free speech score 2 down the bottom here. The same gradient we see, that the poorest people benefit most from free speech, however whichever level of free speech we have. Once we also, because we're going to use cardinal and binary variables in the instrumental variables equations, I've estimated the same equations for OLS, and we get exactly the same results as we had before in terms of the gradient, so I won't go into those any further. The education gradient is significant when in the OLS, when we interact education with total free speech, but not with mid-level of free speech. It's also, when we do the other versions, it's relevant. We have the same gradient for the cardinal variables, but not for when we have free speech measured as a binary variable.
1 minute, Arthur.
Okay, we get the same, basically the same results for income, for the income gradient, especially when we estimate it. If for income, we get the same gradient for both cardinal and binary specifications, and similarly for education with the cardinal specification. So the conclusions, that we see a very clear income gradient, whether it's the OLS estimates or the IV estimates for free speech. Basically poorer or less educated people benefit most from high levels of free speech, which implies that free speech has an empowerment effect. Further work on this could include other measures of free speech, as the VDEM database from, I think, the Netherlands, maybe Germany, which we could use as an alternative measure of free speech. And we could also try and search for other instruments, although it's not easy, and that's why this work generally hasn't done that. Pending any further work on this, our conclusion is that free speech most strongly benefits marginalised people within a country. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. So for those who came in later, so these are special sessions in which each presenter has a discussant who has already read the paper beforehand. And for Arthur, the discussant is Philip. So Arthur, you can stop sharing your screen.
Oh, sorry, I'll have that. Yep. Hang on.
I don't know, Philip, whether you have prepared slides or not.
Yeah, I've just got some slides.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to work out how to stop sharing the screen. It's because I pressed something.
Can you just close the?
Oh, here we go. No. Chat pin, hide on. Hang on, I'm just trying to search for the thing that will allow me to do that.
What happens if you just close the PowerPoint, Arthur?
Yeah, I'll try that. Does that work? Screen
Yes.
sharing?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Good. Oh yes, I'm back to the. Yep. Okay. Thanks.
So can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Arthur. I really enjoyed reading that. It's not something I normally would have read. My comments stand under two headings. One is theory and the other is the empirical work. I thought the paper was innovative in terms of applying economic thinking to a non-market good. I saw the paper as mainly internally motivated. In other words, it came from your and your co-author's own thinking rather than addressing an existing debate. There appeared to be limited literature on the personal as opposed to institutional drivers of free speech and no previous use of subjective well-being. So your central question is whether demand for free speech behaves as luxury or necessary good. And then you brought in the free time versus no time argument. Those that have resources have free time, those that don't have resources have no time. I thought this might be just a little thin because it's linked only to economic theory. I'd like to see a place in here for considering the role of power, discrimination, gender, and race and minority positioning. And I said most of these, but a lot of them will cut across income and education dimensions. You've, in a sense, brought all those down to a single dimension or two dimensions, income and education. So I'm just wondering whether the umbrella of luxury versus necessary goods is going to be wide enough to really hold the real world drivers of demand for free speech, the sorts of drivers which the man in the street and woman in the street might think are really are the drivers, like discrimination and things like that. And the empirics, I thought that was innovative within the conventional modeling framework. And you needed to be really quite specific in order to get down to focus on those two particular questions you asked. However, the R squared in most of the regressions is quite low, although not unusually low. So there's a lot of variance still remaining to be explained. I thought it would be useful to explore the residuals from your model and either graphically using country labels or actually mapping the residuals to see how the degree or how well the income and education models fitted across the world. And that could be condition 1 year as well. The third point is that your data covers almost 40 years, and comparing how income and education behaved at the beginning and the end of the period with respect to free speech could be quite helpful, as opposed to simply controlling for time or the way with the World Value Survey. So yeah, thanks for the paper. I'll just stop sharing.
Yep. Okay, thank you for the comments. Yeah, the time is also up for this presentation. So if you have questions or comments for Arthur, please use the chat, and then Arthur can answer questions in the chat. And then we move on now to Philip's presentation.
Hi again, everyone. So I'm asking the following question, and I want to begin with the topics I'm going to be the sequence in which I'm going to be dealing with this topic. So I want to begin with the urban well-being paradox. And perhaps before that, I should just say that this has been prepared as a paper in a special issue of sustainability. The urban well-being paradox, as most of you will be more than well aware, is basically referring to this thick line here that curves downwards. It reflects the fact that subjective well-being rises in urban areas relative to rural as a country develops, up until some point, after which subjective well-being, at least in the larger cities, on average tends to fall. And in work, Martijn and two Martins and myself and Carlos did a little while ago offers empirical support for that. There's, apart from this being of intrinsic interest in itself, there's a wider question which it bears on, and that is the way it may help feed into the Easterland paradox. The idea, in very simple terms, is that if people move from an area of the country to another area of the country where their well-being drops, then, and if that occurs over time as a function of development, then the very process of agglomeration that accompanies development can contribute to lower well-being, or in the Easterland's case, to the maintenance rather than growth of well-being. So what I'm saying is that there are geographic correlates that play a role in explaining the Eastern paradox. I'm not going to develop that here, but it sits there as an interesting issue. So the question I'm asking is, what's the relationship between well-being and residents in the large urban centres of contemporary Europe? Mixed results in the literature. The unresolved issues, there are several, but the one I want to look at today is the fact that only the mean of the well-being distribution is being used as a comparison statistic. There are results that differ according to the way well-being is defined. And an important issue has to do with the nature of urban size and how they're defined. And as I'll show in a minute, they're defined primarily by respondents. Now, I'm using the 2018, which is the latest European Social Survey, very large sample size per country, and approximately 30 countries in each wave, and they rotate. Nice, wide, well-being variable, and there's a good range of exponential variables. So, two questions: the life satisfaction question, which you're all familiar with, and the happiness question. I do in the paper addresses, I do the analysis for both, but in this paper I'm just going to refer to the life satisfaction question. There are interesting differences between the two. Now, the thing that fascinates me about the European situation is just how diverse that that part of the world is. I'm going to be and I refer to this in terms of the difference between Denmark's average life satisfaction score and Bulgaria's. I'm going to be using Austria, for reasons I'll show you in a minute, as a proof of concept for this particular approach. I also look at Czechia and Slovakia as supplements to the paper itself. So just as an orientation to the variation in well-being, this cumulative distribution plot plots the well-being distribution, life satisfaction of 4 countries, with scores on the y-axis and quantiles on the x-axis. And I found it an instructive way of comparing countries in this case. And we can approach the way we compare these countries from the x-axis point of view, and simply ask how many, if we take the top half of the distribution in the Danish case, then we find that half of them are well over 8.5 in terms of the life satisfaction score. You compare that with Bulgaria, and over half the population is only over 5. So there's a dramatic difference between the two. Or we can look at it the other way. We can look at it from the y side, the vertical axis side, and we can approach the issue from the score point of view, and say, well, what proportion in the Danish case are score over 5? And you find it's only about 5% of the distribution, compared to 50% in the Bulgarian case. So all this is a way of introducing 2 things: the diversity within Europe, and the fact that the well-being distribution itself has a lot of information in it that can be explored. And so these are the 3 countries I'm looking at, but today I'll just look at Austria. And you can see its distribution is just below Denmark. Okay, so the other big problem is defining urban. Most of these surveys, in fact all of them, don't use an objective measure of cities, urban, or agglomeration, or whatever. They all ask, ironically, the respondent to give that information. Even the World Value Survey, it doesn't ask the respondent, but it relies on the interviewer to decide what size of town they're looking at. So there's a high potential for measurement error when it comes to identifying what is urban and what is rural. Just give you an example. Here's Austria, and the nuts regions I've listed down the side, and the 5 domicile. This is a European social survey term, domicile. It just refers to the type of settlement. The 5 of them across the top. And you can see here, when people are asked where they live, they can answer any of the numbers of any of the categories across the top. And when you look at the regions, you find that, well, in virtually every region except 2, there are big cities. And then you can add in suburbs of big cities as well. This is not, therefore, identifying a geographically specific agglomeration. This question is simply identifying a relative size of town in wherever you live. Now, that may be useful for certain purposes, but it's not very useful when it comes to understanding the urban well-being paradox, because the urban well-being paradox is focused primarily on those very large, usually the very largest metropolitan or conurbation of a country and its city. So we have to look at an alternative way of measuring agglomeration. Excuse me. I wanted to see to what extent there was a negative association between well-being and agglomeration as defined by the big city definition across Europe. So I applied that top equation to each of the 29 countries in the European Social Survey, and then arrayed the estimated coefficient on the basis of the sign and direction of that coefficient. And what we see is quite a variety. The bottom here we have Austria, with the most negative effect of living in a big city. Remember, big city is not just Vienna, it's a number of places all over Austria. So I wanted to pick different contrasting countries in this distribution to see if they behave differently. So Austria at the bottom, then my next one is Czechia, and the other one is Slovenia. Now, I also wanted to pick countries that had the new definition I'm going to use for urban, which is the functional urban area. And not all of these have had their functional urban area defined, but those that I've put arrows here do. So, if you want to ask, is there evidence for the urban well-being paradox if it's measured by cities? We can say, well, yes and no. Some countries do and some countries don't. So I thought a more appropriate way of defining urban was to draw on the recent OECD functional urban area classification. Now, these are not defined solely for one part of the country, and you can see in the Austrian case, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 actually, areas they define as functional urban areas. However, Vienna is the large metropolitan centre, and that's the one I'm going to use here. However, these functional urban areas are not tied to individuals in any of the surveys. The only geographic tag individuals have is their association with the NUTS region where they live. So for this exercise, I've had to approximate use the NUTS approximation of the functional urban area. In this particular case, it's not bad, and most of the other countries I've looked at, it's much closer actually. In the case of Prague, it's almost exact. So I'm going to be looking at those who live in Vienna, or what I call Vienna per, if you are functional urban region or functional urban area. I use both, it means the same thing. And I'm going to compare their well-being with the rest of the country. Before I did that, I thought, well, let's have a look and see how these different definitions of agglomeration actually behave in terms of the life satisfaction equation. And you can see here that they behave very similarly. Okay? The living in a big city, no matter where it is negatively related. If you add the suburbs, it drops down a little bit. You take Vienna city itself, it has this coefficient and all the way down to here. So in actual fact, you might say, well, the geography doesn't make a difference. Well, it doesn't in this particular case, but this is a much more conceptually and empirically satisfactory measure of agglomeration, in my view. So what's this agglomeration effect? Well, if you look at the Austrian case and you simply do a frequency distribution and smooth it out as a camera density function on the left, you can see that living inside Vienna has a lower well-being distribution than outside. And the quantile version is given on the right-hand side. Okay. Now we can see here, if you live inside Vienna, then you're half 1/10 is above 5, and it's above 6 outside. All right, so the question is, what difference does this, how does this relationship, how should it be analyzed? And in particular, are there distributional consequences? So the central question I'm asking in this paper is, does the impact of residents within an agglomeration have a different impact on different parts of the well-being distribution? Are those in the low well-being quartiles more or less negatively impacted versus those in the middle or in the higher well-being quartiles? In short, are there well-being distributional consequences arising from the presence of very large agglomerations? And then down here, What controls do we need to put in place before we can identify those distributional consequences? So we're interested in those gaps at different quantiles. So the approach I took was to take the basic relationship between well-being and agglomeration that I showed before, the first two terms in equation 2 here, and add a set of controls for the demographics, for unemployment, for human capital variables, and for social capital variables. And these are the means of those sets of variables. And the regressions itself tell us tell us something quite interesting, and it is that the negative effect of living in the Vienna functional urban area continues to be strongly negative regardless of the controls you put in. So although the personal controls matter a little bit, they don't have a fundamental effect. So what about the quantile regression model? Oops, I'm going over time, sorry. The least squares regression for a response y and predictor x models a conditional mean, but it does not capture the conditional variance, let alone the conditional distribution of y given x. Okay, as such, the conditional mean function provides only a partial view of the relationship. Okay.
1 minute, Philip.
Yep, okay. So the quantile model, on the other hand, provides information about the relationship between the outcome y and the regresses x at different points of the conditional distribution of y. But this has only been applied to the subject of well-being distribution in a few cases, a couple on rural-urban, but none have been applied to the urban well-being paradox. So what we see here is essentially that last model in the OLS case, the full set of variables applied to each quantile. Now, you look at the, sorry, something's supposed to pop up when I press here. You look at these coefficients here, and you'll notice that contrary to what I expected, they actually rise with the quantile. My prior going into this analysis was that those individuals who occupied the lower quantiles would in fact be more disadvantaged by living in the agglomeration. That turned out not to be the case. You can then graph the way in which each variable behaves with respect to life satisfaction. By the way, the OLS mean is the dashed line in its confidence intervals are just either side of it. And you can see that there's heterogeneity in virtually every variable, not all of them, but this is a telling one, this here. If you feel safe walking at night, it has a much bigger effect on your well-being if you're in the lower quantiles than if you are in the upper quantiles. Now, when we come back to the agglomeration case, we find that, strangely enough, the living in the agglomeration actually appears to raise the well-being of those in the very low quantiles, which is contrary to what I was expecting. And this is just that same graph, which these weren't supposed to be here, in which I applied different controls, and it made very little difference to that overall conclusion. So, summary. Students of the Wellbeing paradox are focused on the way in which the residents of large cities have returned lower well-being. I repeat that question, and most of them have been applied to the average. So, my concern in this paper is the possibility that impact of residents in large urban centres may not be even across countries' wellbeing distribution. The policy concern is that residents in the largest groups may have a more severe negative impact. In fact, that wasn't what turned out in the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Okay, then I'm the discussant of this paper. So if you can stop sharing your screen, then I will share my screen. Yes. Okay, so thank you, Philip, for this very interesting paper. It's an original paper that addresses three main issues. First, a common criticism on the literature that agglomeration is often subjectively defined, and you have an objective way to define agglomeration. The second one is that you test an overlooked aspect, so the heterogeneity of effects over the subjective well-being distribution. And finally, you provide an update whether the urban well-being paradox still exists, mostly in the paper. And what's confused me is why you used the fur area, because the European Social Survey has NUTS level data available. And I think now you also showed them in your presentation. So you can, for example, exactly see who lives in Vienna. So NUTS 1.3. So I was confused why you use a more messy definition of objective agglomeration rather than these readily available NUTS categories that actually, even for many countries, are available on the NUTS 3 level. So I also wondered why you use a case study and not just run it for all countries. Then in terms of framing, I would put more, or you can perhaps put more emphasis on this differentiation between objective and subjective settlement types or agglomeration. Yeah, so you can put that in the title and pose a research question about it, because I think that's really a strength that you could have in your paper to deal with this criticism. So objectively define the settlement type. Let me, I'll skip these for time reasons. Yeah, also, I was not completely sure from your presentation and the paper what the urban well-being paradox refers to. Also, because you sometimes equate subjective well-being and well-being, while I think that in this paradox, this urban well-being paradox, it's about different types of well-being giving different conclusions about whether it's good to live in urban areas or not. So I wouldn't equate well-being with subjective well-being. And I would like to see some more about why this urban well-being paradox occurs, at least in your theoretical section. So to make this distinction more between selection effects and the quality of the environment. And in terms of econometrics, I would also show your quantile regressions without endogenous variables. Now you do it for your full model, but actually there are quite some variables in there that might, that are endogenous, so they might reduce effects. They might be mediators. And actually, it would be really nice to do this analysis also with panel data, because you use cross-sectional data, but I myself work with data from the SUB and the Swiss household panel and the Dutch LIS panel, in which you also have objective data about people's residence. So you could maybe in a follow-up paper use panel data for this exercise. Yeah, so that were my comments. And then, oh, you cannot see me. Then also time is up here, but for the people who want to ask questions or provide comments to Philip, please use the chat and Philip can answer the questions in the chat.
Thanks, Martijn.
Yeah, okay, then we will move on with my presentation. I'm not, yeah, now it works. Okay, so this is joint work with Randall Birnberg, who is a US immigrant in Germany himself. And that's how we came to this case study of US immigrants in Germany. And we look at their happiness in their daily socio-cultural integration process. And our study is motivated by the struggles that many immigrants face to culturally and socially integrate into their host countries. And this cannot be explained, these struggles, from a long-term perspective. Because actually, the cross-sectional studies and studies with yearly panel data show a really positive effect of socio-cultural integration on subjective well-being and other forms of well-being. But what about the short term? Well, there is no clear picture of how integration affects subjective well-being in the short term. And our thesis was that these daily integration behaviors, such as speaking the language of the host country or interacting with people from the host country, negatively affects the momentary happiness of immigrants, particularly in early stages of socio-cultural integration. And I will come back to that on the next slide. And this will ultimately discourage immigrants from engaging in such integration behaviors. So our study objective is to better understand the obstacles and struggles in the daily socio-cultural integration process. And if we have this better understanding, then we also understand better the causes and consequences of socio-cultural integration. We have three hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that immigrants feel happier when interacting in their mother tongue than in the host country's majority language, in particular for those who are less fluent in the majority language. And there are some mechanisms that motivate this hypothesis. So first of all, the second language literature shows that speaking a second language leads to negative emotions such as nervousness, fear, embarrassment, or frustration if having trouble speaking. It can also lead to positive emotions such as pride, so proud of speaking the language and enjoyment of learning it, for example. But it seems that these negative emotions outbalance the positive emotions. Then also speaking a second language is a fatiguing endeavor. And in a second language, people have less ability to comprehend and express oneself. This might also negatively affect their momentary happiness. And for non-fluent speakers or people with an accent, it can lead to prejudice or discrimination, for example, in public areas. And these above mechanisms, they diminish with better language proficiency. For example, when you're better at speaking the language, it becomes less fatiguing, you're better able to express yourself, etc. Then our second hypothesis was that immigrants feel happier when interacting with people from their heritage society than with people from the host society, and in particularly those who are less acculturated. Well, speaking with people from the host society, it can improve mutual understanding and break down barriers, and can be a cultural learning experience, and that might positively influence momentary happiness. But more often it leads to language and cultural and attitudinal boundaries that complicate this interethnic exchange. So people feel more are less comfortable in this situation. And it's also what has been shown, that people naturally feel closer and more comfortable around more similar people. So for example, people of the same ethnicity. And also these above negative mechanisms, we hypothesize that they diminish with better acculturation, for example, because these cultural boundaries become smaller. And the final hypothesis is that in the long term, socio-cultural integration positively relates to enduring subjective well-being. I will not go into depth on this because this is a well-shown finding in the literature, but we just include it to make a contrast between the short and long term. So our target population for our studies are the US immigrants in Germany. We used a convenience sample, mostly collected by my co-author, Randall, via all kinds of expat organizations. And our data collection was done through the data reconstruction method. So we asked the US immigrants 6 questions for 1 week period. So how they were feeling, how they were doing, where they were, who was with them, the nationalities of their interaction partners, if they had any, and the language spoken. And these were happiness diaries. Then the analysis sample contains 213 respondents who completed 884 days of happiness diaries, in total more than 6,000 activities, 60 hours per respondent with an average activity duration of 2 hours. So our estimation strategy is a fixed effects model specification in which we regress momentary happiness, which is measured with a standard question like how happy were you during this activity, on nationality. So nationality is a categorical variable that can either be German, American, a mix of German and Americans, or other nationalities. We also regressed on language, speaking German, English, a mix of languages or other. Some momentary controls, so the type of activity, for example, eating or working, the location, for example, at home or at work, interaction partners, for example, your family or colleagues, the day of the week and the time of the day, and then of course the individual fixed effects. So our main results show that there's no main effect of nationality on momentary happiness. So the American immigrants felt equally happy with Germans as with Americans. But when we look at column 2, we see that they did feel happier speaking English than German. They also felt happier speaking a mix of English and German than German. So this difference is about 0.2 points on the 0-10 scale. And then we also, in column 3, simultaneously included nationality and language, and then our conclusions of columns 1 and 2 hold. Then we moved on to check whether this impact of speaking English versus German is contingent on language proficiency, and we see a very strong effect. So people who have low language proficiency, they felt more than a point higher when speaking English than when speaking German. But we also see that people with very good language proficiency didn't feel happier speaking English than speaking German. Then in the right graph, we also looked at acculturation, so the moderating role of acculturation. And we see that people with poor acculturation, they feel happier when being with Americans than when being with Germans. But once a moderate level of acculturation is reached, then there is no difference between being with Americans or Germans for these American immigrants. Well, I haven't taught you how I measured language proficiency in acculturation. That's what you can see here. So language proficiency is a standard question. How well do you know the language? And acculturation are these three blue shaded items. So also cultural affinity and feeling at home. And then for hypothesis 3, we use a socio-cultural integration index. So we don't focus only on acculturation, but also more on the social part. So we include the proportion of time speaking in German, proportion of time with a German interaction partner, and the proportion of friends in Germany who are German. And then, consistent with the previous literature, we show that in the long term, there are strongly positive relationship between socio-cultural integration and enduring subjective well-being. So this is now an OLS regression for hypothesis 3, while the other were fixed effects model. So here, causality, we have to be more careful with that. Then I conducted some auxiliary analysis. So first of all, we checked for reverse causality, and we didn't find an effect of momentary happiness in T-1 on language use or the nationality of interaction partner. So there's no strong evidence of reverse causality. Second important analysis was that we found that immigrants do interact less with Germans when experiencing higher momentary costs. And this is important because this might mean that these immigrants might be locked into a situation of low socio-cultural integration, because when they experience these higher momentary costs at the initial stages of integration, then they interact less, so they will never overcome this barrier. But we didn't find this for speaking in German. So we actually find partial evidence for this locking in effect. Reassuringly, we also find declining benefits of using mixed languages or mixed nationalities compared to German with better language proficiency. So these are consistent with our main results, but then for mixed languages. We also tested for a lagged effect of language use on momentary happiness, but we didn't find one, so the effect seems to be short-lived. We found that the immigrants felt particularly happier speaking English with friends and acquaintances, but not with family members or colleagues. And yeah, we thought initially that they would be happier speaking English mostly with acquaintances and colleagues, because these are less comfortable social environments, while friends and family members are like closer to the people, so they might feel more comfortable, but we only saw that partly in the data. We also saw that better integrated immigrants spent less time on passive leisure at home and alone, and more time with their colleagues and at work. So this shows to some extent that yeah, this low integration levels also lead to activities that are not necessarily associated with high happiness, such as being alone, passive leisure. And then we also checked what are really the drivers of this enduring effect, and these are mostly this cultural affinity, feeling at home, and interacting with Germans. Then the conclusions. So in our case study, we find that immigrants who are not fluent in the host country's dominant language feel happier when communicating in their mother tongue. We also found that interacting with people from the host country affects momentary happiness negatively for less acculturated immigrants. And we found a positive relationship between socio-cultural integration and enduring subjective well-being. So the implications of our findings are that socio-cultural integration is an investment that pays off in the long run, but involves short-term costs to happiness. It can help explain the commonly limited or slow integration of immigrants, but it can also help explain, for example, ethnic segregation. So if you feel happier speaking your own language or from your heritage society, that might promote ethnic segregation, but it might also promote social isolation because the costs of interacting with people from the host country are higher, especially for immigrants who don't have many people from the heritage society available to communicate with. This might lead to social isolation. And it underscores the importance of psychological safe environments for integration. For example, integration behaviors are easier with in comfortable environments such as language schools or with your partner than with, for example, colleagues or acquaintances or so. And the critical question is to what extent these results are generalizable, because this was just a case study for the American immigrants. Well, we cannot test it, but we argue that there should be that the results should be quite generalizable because the theoretical mechanisms I discuss apply across migration contexts. There's a similar relationship between subjective well-being and socio-cultural integration in other migrant contexts, so in the long term. So in this sense, the Americans were not very, very specific in terms of not becoming happy of integration. And finally, this case study was a quite conservative test of our hypothesis because Americans are regarded relatively positively by Germans because they bring much human capital, so compared to some other types of immigrants. So thank you. Then we move on to the discussant.
Can I share my screen now?
Yes, your turn, Arthur.
Right. Stuff. Okay, thanks. Can you see the screen there, Martijn?
Yes.
Great. So I really enjoyed reading this paper from the two of you. It's a really important topic. Why do some immigrants struggle to integrate? It's relevant to many countries, and especially where I am, New Zealand is one of the highest proportion of immigrants of any countries in the world. One of the studies I thought you could have referred to actually is a study of migrants to New Zealand by Steve Stillman et al., where migrants came to New Zealand on a lottery system and they compare what they expected to find in terms of their well-being with what they actually found and could compare that with people from their home countries. And so that's be very nice. I've got the reference there for you at the bottom. I was really pleased to see using day reconstruction method. I think it's still an underused approach and has a lot to teach us and used this way. So your key findings is that we know that you confirm that integration is linked to a long-term rise in happiness, but integration in the short term seems to lead to reduced short-term happiness, at least for certain groups. The data is from 213 US migrants to Germany. I really like the idea of looking at developed country migrants to a developed country, because most of our migration studies often think about less developed countries, people from LDCs moving to developed countries. As you say, it's a convenient sample, it's not randomly sampled, so we have to be a little bit careful about that. But I'd like to know a lot more about these people. Why are they in Germany? And one traditionally sort of thinks of Americans in Germany being there by choice or not by choice. People not there by choice might be people in the military, or they might be tied partners of others. And I'd have thought it would be really useful to distinguish between people who voluntarily went to Germany and those who didn't. Also, their intended length of stay. Did they intend to be there for just a few months or a year or two, or did they intend to be there for the rest of their lives? That would make a big difference to their acculturation. What about their partner? Can their partner speak German fluently? That seemed to be really crucial to me to know that. And also if you could know anything about their personality traits, risk aversion, etc. The other thing is the cultural background of the migrant. I really wanted to know about this. US is a country of migrants itself. So when you talk about American migrants to Germany, are they people who've been in America for 6 generations, or are they first generation or second generation US citizens who would be very different in terms of their attitude? So it'd be really useful to see a table of these sort of characteristics and length of time in Germany, whether people have children or not, and have a look at the outcomes according to the characteristics of people. The other thing that some of the data, there were some peculiarities in the data that I thought could have given you some opportunities to look at things. So the sample appears mainly the sample of Americans appear to mainly mix with non-US, non-Germans. So this is the interaction partners that you list in your data appendix, is that 9% of interaction partners of Americans are with other Americans, 23% with Germans, 10% are mixed, and 58% other, which I presumed meant sort of Italians and French and everyone else. So if that's the case, then you're not really comparing people looking interacting with Germans. You're looking at them mainly interacting with people who are neither German nor American, which seemed rather odd. And same with the language spoken. The sample mainly speaks non-English, non-German. So the language spoken, 31% English, 12% German, but 46% other. So I was really intrigued by this other group being the dominant group, neither German nor American, and whether you could leverage this in any way. It signaled to me that these may be non-mainstream US migrants. They could be first generation US migrants who've moved to Germany. I'd like to see on the back of that the interactions of each of nationality and language with other characteristics of the people. You went into that a little bit towards the end, but I could see more being done there in terms of sex, age, whether they have kids, reason for being in Germany, their education levels, etc., and their length of time in Germany, which of course is an endogenous variable, because those who didn't like being in Germany would probably have left, and so you've got a selection bias issue there as well that you'd have to think about. And I think you could have probably looked at the nationality times language more, especially with the other categories that I mentioned. You note that you can't treat the estimates as causal, so it would be really good to find about why some migrants choose to integrate more than others. And again, that might be based on those various characteristics of the people, or using whether they're military or tied partners, etc., which could be very different reaction if they're tied partners than if they're the primary person who came to Germany in a partnership. And then utilize these different cultural backgrounds, especially using the other categories. So I'll leave it at that. And
yeah, thank you. Excellent comments, Arthur. I'm also surprised now to see those big other categories. So I'm going to look into that again. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it was just sort of hidden away in the appendices.
yeah. Okay, we'll move on to Stephanie now.
Okay, I'm here. Right, so let's share screen. Can everybody see that?
So
yes.
Also, to me, it applies that people can ask questions and give comments in the chat so that we can move on with Stephanie.
Okay, great. Martijn, I like talking. So you can't give me a 1-minute warning, because then I'll have 20 minutes left to speak. So can you give me, please, a 5-minute warning of my time when it's up? So because I need to get to the crux. So if I'm not there, I can skip forward to there. Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. So we will be talking about big data and happiness today. And as Martijn said in the beginning, this is a chapter that we wrote for the Handbook of Labor and Human Resources and Population Economics. So we will have introduction, we will talk shortly about survey data, big data, but then I want to get to the crux of the discussion, which is what is currently being done in terms of happiness and organic data. And then we'll have some concluding remarks. I'm going to be a doomsday about big data, not really, but some cautious notes about big data in the end. So we all know that when it comes to subjective well-being, it's got both a cognitive and an affective element to it. We know that cognitive is the evaluation of life versus the affective side is when we talk about feelings, emotions, and moods. Up until now, primarily what we know about subjective well-being, we have learned from using survey data, and that's not a bad thing. Nobody says that the role for survey data is gone. We know that it's still instrumental and plays a vital role in us understanding subjective well-being and human well-being for that matter. However, it's not without its problems. We know that there's a timeliness issue and a cost issue. We know there's significant time lags for the survey data results to be released, and it's costly to run. It's costly to get survey data. Additionally, we know that there is the limitation characteristic of all self-reporting measures embedded in survey data. And we know that survey data are limited in both the coverage, the space, and the time, meaning that they cannot be measured at frequencies most useful for decisive government decision-making, nor reflect policy decisions made at local level. And lastly, the wording and the order of the survey is also an issue. If you follow, for example, a question regarding a person's income with a question about life satisfaction, then there will be a marked difference in the assigned score. It will be lower. What I'm getting to is that survey data has served us well thus far, and it still has a very vital role to play. However, we face a changing world, an ever-changing world, and we need high-frequency data if we're going to give policymakers the tools to make effective decision-making in almost real time. And this is where I will cue our unlikely heroes. And our unlikely heroes we find in the form of big data, but we will talk about it now, actually organic data in the forms of both Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Google Trends. If I had time, and maybe in discussion, I will throw some facts at you that will blow your mind, but I don't have time. So when we talk about big data, what are we talking about? We all know big data is classified by the 3 V's, velocity, volume, and variety. It's massive amounts of data. Quick fact, Google does, I can't remember, 75,000 queries per second, 2.5 trillion searches a year. That's a massive amount of data just alone from Google. There's a distinction between what we call big data and organic data. Big data is data that gets collected for a specific purpose, such as stock market movements. You collect stock market movements and you record it as high frequency intraday data for the specific purpose of predicting what's going to happen in future stock markets. However, organic data is seen as data which is a byproduct of its original intent. Twitter is a very good example of that. Why do you tweet? You tweet because you want to express yourself amongst those that you see to be your peers. But now we use Twitter and tweets to measure the real-time evaluative mood of a nation. Definitely not the original intent of a tweet. However, this rich source of information gives us social scientists wealth of information to study human behavior. Now, the benefits of big data, quite a few. Timeliness. You get almost instantaneous real-time information at the tips of your fingers. 2, it allows us to listen, actually listen to what our well-being concerns are, the people's well-being concerns are. People that use Twitter and Facebook reveal what people care about most. Governments don't have to now rely on predefined explicit questions anymore. Thirdly, we can observe people's behavior and not just their opinions. Now, these revealed preferences allows the main concerns of citizens to emerge spontaneously. It doesn't suffer from non-response bias, and the costs are low. relatively low, much lower than if you were going to do survey data. Challenges and limitations, all of which, doesn't matter what study you do, what data you use, you've got challenges and you've got limitations. The first one is that when you work with social media, we've got to accept that you are working with a non-representative sample. The elderly don't tweet, although we know that Trump tweets and Biden tweets and South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, they tweet. So we do have some elderly, but the majority do not tweet. Children don't tweet, so they are underrepresented, and we have this biased, non-uniform sample. However, I would say that the demographics of Facebook and Twitter are known, and corrections in the style of stratified sampling can be made. Lastly, people may tweet or post in a socially desirable fashion. You want to be politically correct all of the time, so therefore you might not be presenting your true emotions or opinions. Organic data has been used in numerous disciplines. It's been used in psychology, economics and finance, and sociology. But sociology is the one that has embraced the use of organic data the most thus far, and it permeates through health, religion, crime and violence, and politics. However, the question I want to get to is whether organic data is relevant to happiness research. And the answer is an overwhelming, resounding yes, it is relevant. 3 indices that I would like to quickly run through with you that uses organic data to measure happiness is the Odometer Subjective Wellbeing Index, and then last, the Gross National Happiness Index Today project. Majority of us, if not all of us, know about the odometer. So the odometer is one of the first measures. Dodds and Danford started it in 2008 using organic data. They use 4 different corpora. They use Google Books, New York Times articles, music lyrics, and Twitter. And what they do is they extract the 5,000 most often used words from each one of these corpora, and then they make a composite set of over 10,000 words. And what they do is they assign a score on a 9-point scale of happiness from 1 sad to 9 happy to each one of these words. The happiest word apparently is laughter, with a happiness score of 8.5 out of 9. Where does the word happiness fall? Yes, I hear you ask, where does it fall? Second. So the word happiness has got a score of 8.44 out of 9. The lowest scored word, so the saddest word according to their corpora, is terrorist. The second last one is suicide. So what do they do? So once the happiness values are derived for each word, the odometer is constructed. What they do is Dodds and his team get a constant stream of about 10% of all of the tweets in the world. And then what they do is they bin all of the tweets extracted in a specific day. Now, once they have those tweets binned, it accumulates to approximately 200 million tweets, and each word receives the predetermined happiness score. So if you haven't seen a odometer before, but I think most of you have, the bottom of your screen shows you what the odometer looks like. So this is just a snippet of the late 2019 up until the corona outbreak. And you can see that the odometer shows those which you think should be there. Happiness increases with public holidays, such as Christmas Eve, Valentine's Day, Independence Day. It decreases with things like mass shootings. So even the odometer caught the mass shootings in Christchurch that we had in March in 2019. And then in the right-hand side, the bottom of the screen, you can see when COVID hits. Limitations of odometer. It working with Twitter, so it doesn't matter who works with Twitter, you're going to face that one specific limitation, and that is that you're working with a non-representative sample. But additionally, what Dodds and his team's doing is they are using text analysis and not sentiment analysis. And the problem with text analysis is that it can lead to an inaccurate sentiment, where you do not take the entire context of the tweet or the sentence or the written text into consideration. They do not detect the emotions that underpins the tweets, which means they cannot say whether the level of happiness change is due to an increase in negative emotions, such as anger or sadness, or positive emotions such as joy. And lastly, they only analyze tweets in English. Now that's relevant because I'll show you now. The second one I want to discuss is one that was created by Sarun Kurimi and Iarkis. Fascinating work. Now they also use Twitter, also organic data, also tweets, and they use integrated sentiment analysis for their index. The index is only available for Japan and Italy, and they make a composite index of subjective and perceived well-being, and they roughly base it on the Happiness Planet Index. But I want to get to the next slide to show you what it consists of. So you'll see on the right-hand side, you've got 8 dimensions that they include in their composite index, and that ranges from emotional well-being to vitality, resilience, positive functioning, right down to quality of job. And then what they do is they encapsulate that into 3 well-being areas: the personal well-being, social well-being, and well-being at work. In subsequent papers by Iarkis and his team, they have actually been successful in integrating Twitter data with official or administrative data. However, limitations. For some reason, they stopped in 2017. Don't know why. So they've got a limited time series of 2012 to 2017. They also do not analyze emotions that underpins these tweets. And lastly, they only analyze tweets made in Japanese or Italian. So they have no English tweets that they use for their index. And then lastly, I want to talk about the Gross National Happiness Index, which is also called the GNH.Today project. Now, I might be smallest part biased, but I think this is the best index ever created. You know, Iarkis and the odometer can go to sleep. Seriously, this is the future. So Talita and myself launched the real-time measure of the evaluative mood of a nation in the beginning of 2019. Now, we call it the evaluative mood of the nation because we are certain, or we're of the opinion, but certain, that our measure includes both a cognitive and an affect dimension. We also use Twitter. We extract all tweets that come through. We extended the project to include the emotions that analyze each word in the tweets as it comes through. We distinguish between 8 different emotions, go from joy to disgust to surprise to sadness. Now, initially in 2019, we launched this project for only South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia. But since 2020, the beginning of 2020, we also have the GNH live daily for Luxembourg, France, Italy, Spain, Germany, Great Britain, Netherlands, and Belgium. And we are very hopeful to expand even further into more countries in 2020. So this is big data that we're working with, organic data that we're working with. So how exactly we do it? So I'm going to press play here. I'll show you. So what happens if we extract this live feed of tweets from across 9 countries, and as they come in, we use natural language processing to classify the sentiment that analyzes that uncovers the sentiments of each tweet. I'd like to note here that we actually translate 64 different languages into English before we analyze the sentiment of each tweet. Now, according to us, this hasn't been done before. You either find studies focusing on Italian or Japanese tweets or only English, but we do it for 64 different languages. Now, the sentiment analysis determines the sentiment that underpins each one of these tweets, giving it a positive, negative, neutral sentiment. We prefer sentiment analysis, and we think it's better because it allows you to evaluate the entire opinion and not merely a word. And also it's applicable to a wide range of areas such as economics, social science, and political economy. Go away. To give you an idea of the amount of tweets that we extract per day, it ranges all the way. If we start at the top is Belgium. Belgium, we extract over 6,000 tweets per day, up to Great Britain, which is 100,000, over 100,000 tweets a day, down to Luxembourg, which is only 835 tweets per day. But this is per day. And we have started this in 2019. So you can just imagine the mass volume of data that we have. Now, after each tweet has been classified, we apply a sentiment balance algorithm to derive the hourly happiness score. Now, it ranges from 0 to 10, 0 being sad, 10 being happy, with 5 being neutral. Now, this is just a snapshot of the GNH for New Zealand, and I took it from August last year to August this year. And to me, personally, it reflects the heartbeat of a nation. That's how I see it. The two red arrows on your left-hand side and your right-hand side of your screen, currently New Zealand finds itself in level 4 lockdown again. We haven't been in level 4 lockdown since August last year. So the two red arrows on the opposite end of your screen represents both level 4 lockdowns. And we can capture how people react to lockdowns. We can see the happiness that people express when it comes to your holidays, such as Christmas and New Year's. It's fascinating. I think Talita and I are one of those, or some of those people that actually can say our research of happiness makes us happy to see this. In our emotion time series, we use natural language processing again to determine the underlying emotion of every word within the tweet. And in order to derive our time series, we calculate the mean emotion per day. We've done 4 minutes. I can do this. I can do this in 3. We have done various validation exercises to validate our data, because the problem is nothing really exists like this. So what we've done, we've tried different lexicons. We compared sentiment 140 to Bing, to AFIN, to NRC, to SAUZ, and what we find is the data stays highly correlated. We tried timescale invariance. So will the sampling period make a difference to the data that we have? Currently, we sample per hour, then we calculate the GNH, we use the daily average, but we thought, well, what happens if we sample 6 hourly, if we sample daily? And what we found is that the trends are similar, which indicates to us that the timescale at which sampling takes place does not significantly influence the information that we obtain. We did volume invariance. So currently, we extract every tweet that's got a geolocation tag. But we thought, what about different volumes? So we used 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, and 30,000. And what we find with the Pearson correlation coefficient and the one-step correlation coefficient is that the data remains correlated at a 1% significance. Additionally, 2 papers that we did with Francesco, Kelsey, Chiara, and Static, they did additional validation of the GNH. They compared the Eurobarometer average life satisfaction to the GNH for applicable countries. No significant difference. They used changes in consumer confidence. The GNH performed well. They constructed an index of negative emotions using fear, sadness, and anger, and they found that the GNH performed well. So we're doing relatively well in this measure. However, we also have limitations. We're working with a non-representative sample. Why? Because we're working with Twitter. But I do want to stress that even though that is true, it doesn't mean that you cannot work with a non-representative sample. Twitter accommodates so many different groups. We've got individuals, groups, we've got organizations, we've got media outlets. This gives us an disaggregated sample, giving us access to data of a vast length of Twitter users, something that you do not find in survey data. But we also lack demographic information. We don't have gender, age, etc. We only have geolocation, so we can only do in a country or in regions, sub-regions within a country, and then our results should be interpreted as the mean GNH for the geographical area. 2 slides and I'm done. So the work in progress, further validation of the data, that's a never-ending process. We would like to extend to other social media platforms, if possible. We would like to include emojis in our analysis, collaborate more with other institutions, because Talita and I are 2 people and we can't get to everything anymore. We would like to find a way to make the data more representative and somehow combine it with survey data. So my conclusion, big data is here to stay. It has made a permanent change in society and everybody will have to adapt to it. It doesn't mean you throw away survey data. Just like we said in the beginning, we have subjective well-being. You don't throw away gross domestic product. It's complementary. Big data is complementary to what we find with survey data. But we do know that there are fears from psychologists and social scientists about us becoming more antisocial because we lose the ability to communicate face-to-face, which is why I hate these virtual conferences and Zoom. And then the debate about privacy and individual rights will only get worse as time goes by, because for some people, big data equates to what we call Big Brother. Regardless of everything else, one thing we know for certain is that if we want governments to make better informed decisions about human well-being, we need to get them the most updated recent data available. Giving them data that was collected a year ago, it's not going to be enough anymore. Now, big data allows them to do that. And big data also allows them to not just follow like sheep all of the prior theories about what is good for people. They can actually now take the time and the opportunity to listen to the people to hear what they say is good for them. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. I love your enthusiasm. And actually, you have about 31 discussants instead of one discussant. So the floor is open for questions to Stephanie. You can raise your virtual hands if you want to ask a question.
Or, you know, just general comments about how awesome the research is. I'll take that as well. Yes, Alberto.
Yes. Alberto.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I mean, it's a very important topic, and my question is about a bit last slide, which is what are the lack of big data and could be improved, and about representativeness. So, is there any step ahead in the foreseeable future which could guarantee a little bit more of representativeness of the sample, or is there any work in this direction? Because I think it would really give a big leap forward.
I can tell you, Alberto, that apart from Talita and myself, we've got Statek working on it, and then we've got our partners in Vlaanderen at their statistics department. They also do a lot of work in the Twitter space. Everybody is working towards that, trying to figure out a better way to make it representative, ways to put administrative data on top of that, survey data. To me personally, I don't want to say it's going to be the holy grail, but the ultimate would be if you can combine survey and big data together. Can you imagine? The world will be your oyster if you can do that. So currently, we can't say that we can do that at the moment. But we've got different institutions across the globe that's actually working together. It's almost like a small little think tank in terms of how we can make Twitter data and other social media data more representative. Yes. Oh, I forgot to add that New Zealand has always been one of those countries that's well ahead in terms of their well-being and how they assess it. And we got some news the other day that Statistics New Zealand is going to report the gross national happiness as an official statistic, which I think is fantastic. So I'm waiting for the launch of that, and that it will be the first official statistics department in the world to report the GNH as an official statistic about the evaluative mood of a nation, and they will be reporting this alongside other hardcore economic indicators.
Great. We have two more questions. I have first one from Talita. I think it will be a very critical comment because he's a co-author.
It must be critical. Obviously, I am objective, not biased at all. What I want to say is we appreciate critique. We know that the future is big data. We've got tremendous brain power just in this room. So any critique from your side. Then the other thing, to make it more demographic representative, EHERO already did it. So combining it with official data and weighting that, the big data, is definitely giving us an opportunity to make it representative. Can I have a news flash as well? Today we will launch a TED Talk on this. I know academics frown about TED Talks, but Kahneman did a TED Talk, and this is really to disseminate our research on subjective well-being, reaching an audience which we often can't reach policymakers and the public. So let's hope that they listen.
Thank you. Then we can do one more question, and Paul asked a question in the chat. So whether you have looked at the polarization of the data, for example, that in Christmas happiness is higher, but also suicide is higher. How can we, have you looked into that?
No, not at all. No, we haven't looked at that at all. Thus far, all we've done is to look at the sentiment that underpins the tweets. I think that would be more if sorry, who asked the question? Paul. Paul, I would say that is more going to be in the area of not sentiment analysis, but specifically text analysis. That is where the odometer will come into play to measure the happiness score that they have per word. And I've got to assume that they will take suicide increasing and Christmas Day, but they will actually balance that out, and you will see that movement on the odometer. But do we do that? No, we haven't done that because we're not focused on specific words. We just want the sentiment that underpins it and the emotions, but definitely something to look into the future. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, and then, well, more questions are coming in. Well, the time for the session is up, but so feel free to leave the session, but maybe we can just continue and Stephanie can answer the final questions. So the first one is from Becky, and she asked about the skewness of negative and positive sentiments.
Okay, she says, I missed the first part of the presentation, but can you tell a bit more about the skewness of negative and positive sentiment in hourly tweets? In the Netherlands, there is discussion, e.g. about the negative nature of many tweets, and people are actually withdrawing from Twitter because of that. So that would make it less representative. Well,
can I answer?
Sorry?
Can I answer this question?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, we measure, the sentiment is measured as positive, neutral, or negative. So in fact, we monitor all positive tweets, all negative tweets, and we find constantly our positive tweets are higher than our negative tweets. So in that score, we also have been looking at various other sources, other people that do the same thing and extract tweets. And interesting that our researchers in Belgium found the opposite. Negative is higher than positive. So we consider both of them. And for example, an event like the death of somebody, Kobe Bryant, we will find both positive and negative tweets. But then on that day, the negative tweets might outweigh the positive, and you will definitely find a dip in the gross national happiness index. I don't know if that answered the question.
I just think it means that overall there are more negative and positive sentiments expressed on Twitter, and people are leaving Twitter because of the negative environment that they find themselves in.
Not true. I can show you the data for
Yes, it's not. We've been doing these tweets, working with Twitter since the beginning of 2019, and when we started off, one of the critiques that I got in New Zealand was they said, "Oh, why are you working with Twitter? We know that people that tweet are highly educated, left-leaning, high-income earners, and politically savvy." And I said to him, do you read the tweets? Do you actually read the tweets? You've got some, what's the word? If it's not informed, anecdotal. You've got anecdotal evidence to say that you have classified Twitter users in the specific group, but it's not true. If you start working with Twitter and you work with the tweets and you read it, you start to debunk all of these myths that is out there regarding Twitter and Twitter users. And well, Peggy, there might be this idea that there is this more negative and less positive out there, but I can tell you that the tweets that we have and the sentiment as we run it do not justify that.
Well, thank you. I think that that is a good evidence against the discussion in the media. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Becky.
Okay, then 2 final short questions. So maybe short answers.
Offer.
Yeah, why use the button GNH technology?
Offer. Where are you? You put your camera off.
Here we are. Yeah, here we go.
To be honest, I think Talita and I feel that we can kick ourselves now that we started with the GNH using gross national happiness back then. It was what we were measuring, was the happiness, and evolved. To be honest, in the beginning, we weren't quite sure what we were measuring. All we knew is we had this measure and it was accurate to display. And that's why we enlisted Hebron to talk about what it is that we are actually measuring. And that's why we've got the affective and the cognitive side to it. So we started with the gross national happiness idea. And we were cognizant of the fact that Bhutan already have one. So now we use the gross national happiness dot today, because it's not just a gross national happiness measure that's a standalone, but you see it on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. So the dot today is the one that separates the one. It's not just a national account anymore, but it's something that you can see in real time. So from now on everything, we will talk about GNH dot today.
It seems to be crucial because, I mean, GNH in Bhutan is a multi-dimensional poverty index. It's quite a different concept.
Yes,
and that's of course what's known as gross national happiness throughout the world. So to use their term just seems to be it would be like calling it, you know, gross domestic product and then saying, oh, well, just because someone else used that term, we'll use it as well. But I mean, it's gross national, you know, I mean, it's just, I just don't know why you do that. It seems very, very odd, but
yeah, I know. So from now we just call it
for a different term.
It's too late now. It's too late. It's called GNH. So when you got your PhD and you weren't married and you get married, then you don't change your surname, because or else your PhD is in a different surname. So it's out there, and now we do GNH dot today. So from now on, whenever you look for it, dot today, that's the separating factor to reveal that it's organic data, real time, daily.
Okay.
Thanks, Arthur.
Okay, then the final one, and then we really need to stop. There's a question: how do you treat sarcasm? Like, great can be stated in a positive and a negative frame. Question by Jeehoon Boelhouwer.
How do you treat sarcasm? Like, great can be stated in a positive. Well, Jeehoon, I can't really
anymore himself, but
sorry.
Jeehoon is not here anymore himself. He had to leave, but
well, we can't capture sarcasm. We can't. If you say great, then it will be classified as positive. There will be a positive emotion, a happy emotion such as joy or anticipation or surprise or whatever the case might be, will be associated with that word great. We can't capture sarcasm, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, then we're going to close the session. So in 12 minutes, a new GLO EHERO special session starts with 3 great presenters: Kelsey O'Connor, Alberto Prati, and Robin Konieczny. So I hope to see you there in 12 minutes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
For all the presenters, like the discussants, we can share the discussion slides via email with each other.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.